Yeah, I never know what to do when there's music at the beginning. It makes me feel a little bit like Mick Jagger, but I don't look like Mick Jagger. So this is a slightly more expanded version of what you were just told. I'm going to try to explain to you what the work of Sense Research Foundation and indeed a lot of other organizations now that have come into existence recently, what we do and why it shows such promise for helping people to stay healthy late in life. As you've already heard, the consequence of that will be, I believe, that on average people will live a lot longer. And I think that's great. But of course we must always remember that that's a side effect, that the purpose here is simply medicine to prevent people from getting sick. And that's not very controversial, I don't think. Now, the work that we do is actually not very digital. So I want to start by saying a few words about how to connect what we do with the themes of this excellent conference. Digital health, to me, means using the new tools of machine learning and artificial intelligence in combination with the new research tools that produce huge amounts of personalized data on your genome and your epigenome and your metabolome and so on, to put those things together so as to optimize the quality of healthcare that we can provide to you right now. But one thing that it's actually worth bearing in mind is that personalized medicine, or precision medicine as it's often called these days, may actually not be such a big deal in the long run. It's kind of a stopgap. You only need personalization when the medicine that you are personalizing doesn't work very well. You know, we don't have, for example, personalized polio vaccines. And the reason we don't is because we've just got a generic polio vaccine that just works. So that's kind of a way of thinking about it. But, of course, the fact that in the more distant future we may not have all that much need for personalized health is not a statement about the near term. Actually, it kind of leads to the opposite conclusion in the near term. It means that personalized medicine is all the more important right now, before the medicines I'm about to talk about become available, so as to maximize your chances of still being reasonably healthy at the time that these future medicines actually do come along. So I believe that there's actually a pretty good tight linkage between what we do and what this conference is about. Also, some of the leading, most cutting-edge companies working in digital health are working specifically on longevity. And, you know, they're run by friends of mine, and there's a great deal of crosstalk between the more digitally minded, the more bioinformatics-centric companies that are working in this area, and the ones that are working more at the bench, doing molecular biology and cell biology. So let's get going. Now, the problem that we are trying to address here, the problem of ill health in old age, is a problem that has been created as a consequence of our success over the past couple of centuries in solving a different problem. The problem that we solved, of course, is the problem of very large numbers of deaths from infectious diseases. And the statistics are quite breathtaking. In case you don't know them, let me just summarize by saying that 200 years ago, even in the wealthiest, most prosperous countries in the world, literally 40%, more than 1/3 of babies would die before the age of 1. And, of course, people would die very often in childbirth and throughout life. So, of course, the elimination of that problem, the successes that we've had in keeping people from dying early, is the main reason why average longevity is so much greater now than it was back then. It's not the only reason, but it's definitely the main driver. So, of course, this is a cause of celebration. It's fantastic that people are not dying early in life. But it has caused this problem that so many more people than before are now living long enough to suffer from the chronic progressive conditions of old age. And because these conditions are chronic and progressive, kind of by definition, they don't kill you quickly. They take a long time to kill you, which means that you spend a long time in a poor state of health, with a low quality of life, and eating up enormous amounts of money in your medical care. I think that is quite well illustrated by this graph. I'm just showing you American statistics here, but it's the same everywhere. This is just a 50-year time frame from 1960 through to 2010. And what we have here is the red line being the trajectory of the US economy, of the entire gross domestic product of the US. The blue line is the trajectory of medical expenditure in the US. And drawn like that, it doesn't look particularly scary, but it looks terrifying when you divide one by the other. That's what the green line is, the proportion of the US economy that goes on medicine. And it's gone up in just 50 years from 5% up to 18%. I mean, that is just terrifying. And of course, it is the reason why everyone says that, Medicare is going to go bust and so on. And this is not just because the US have this crazy idea of a private healthcare system. It's true in the rest of the world as well. So, in order to address this, I believe that the right place to start is to ask this question I have on this slide. Why is it that the medicines, the medical approaches that have been so successful in eliminating the majority of infectious diseases and stopping people from dying young have not also been successful against the health problems of old age? Because let's face it, it was really simple. Pretty much all we had to do was figure out that hygiene is a good idea, and then it developed very elementary medicines like vaccines and so on. Even mosquito nets. An amazingly large number of lives are being saved with those. So why is the health problem of old age so much more difficult? Well, most people would say that this is the answer. Don't worry, you're not supposed to be able to read this slide. The idea is simply that so many things go wrong with us late in life. And of course, they go wrong at more or less the same time, which means that they interact with each other, they exacerbate each other. It's just overwhelmingly complex. And most people would say, well, this is the reason why the medical profession has failed to solve the health problems of old age. Now, that is part of the answer, but it's only part of the answer. The main part is something completely different, which I'm going to explain now. And I'm going to start by defining the word aging. It's a bit crazy that I would need to do that, really, because aging has been a big topic of, it's been on people's minds since the beginning of civilization. You would kind of think we would have worked out what we mean by it. But actually, if you ask people what aging is, you'll get a lot of different answers. So let's get us all on the same page by giving you one definition. Also, I like this definition because it demystifies aging. It helps you to see that aging is not some kind of terrible enigma that we don't understand. It's very simple. It's just the combination of these two processes that I'm drawing here, a lifelong process and one that happens late in life. The lifelong process, and I really mean lifelong, starting before we're born, is that our metabolism, the entire network of processes that keeps us alive from one day to the next, generates damage. It generates changes to the composition and structure of the body at the molecular and cellular level. And the reason that it makes sense to call those changes damage is because of the right-hand process. The body is set up to tolerate a certain amount of those changes, but only a certain amount. And eventually, the changes exceed that threshold, and you get the health problems of old age, the pathologies late in life. So that's all that aging is, the combination of those two processes. Now, what have we tried so far to do about it? What are the failed approaches to separating metabolism from pathology, to keeping the pathologies from happening? Well, first thing to remember in getting to that is that the definition of aging that I've just told you is not specific to living organisms. Supposing I were asked to define the aging of a car or an aeroplane, I could have used exactly the same definition. A car is built to last a certain amount of time, and during that time, it gradually accumulates various types of initially harmless damage, rust and such like. And then eventually, pathologies start to emerge. The doors fall off, things like that. So it's exactly the same. So now what do? Well, the overwhelming majority of the money and the effort that has been spent on the health problems of old age can be described in this one word, geriatrics. Geriatric medicine consists of attacking the pathologies of old age and just attacking them directly, trying to eliminate them from the body. Now, even this teeny tiny simple diagram can immediately explain to you that that is a brain-dead, completely pointless and idiotic way of going about trying to stop people from getting sick in old age. Just look at it. What we're doing here is we're attacking the consequences of something that's accumulating, the damage. It's kind of a matter of definition almost that geriatrics is going to become progressively less effective. Any medicine that qualifies as geriatric medicine is going to become progressively less effective as time goes on because the damage is continuing to accumulate, so there's going to be more pressure for the pathology to progress. It's just idiotic. And so we may ask, why have we been so fixated on this? Why have we continued to make this mistake? I believe that actually that comes down to something I said a moment ago, the fact that people have a lot of confusion in their minds with regard to the definition of aging. So on this table, what I'm actually trying to answer is the question, in what ways can somebody be sick? So in other words, this is a taxonomy of sickness. Most people would say, if you ask them that question, they would say, well, there's infectious diseases, that's column 1. Then there's genetic diseases, column 2, that a few of us inherit. And then there's the big one, column 3, the chronic progressive diseases of old age, like Alzheimer's, almost all cancers, atherosclerosis and so on. And then most people would say that way out in the stratosphere, there's this fourth thing called aging itself that is totally different. It's natural and it's universal and it's inevitable and it consists of these rather poorly defined nebulous concepts like frailty. And so the way that people think about it is almost that it's off limits to medicine, that it kind of doesn't really make sense to try to develop medicines against aging. That's the way that most people think. And it kind of explains why people get this wrong. Because the real way that one should classify sickness, the correct taxonomy of sickness, is like this. All the columns are the same as they were on the previous slide, but the big black line is in a different place. And that tells you two critically important things. First thing it tells you is that the things in column 3, these chronic progressive so-called diseases of old age, are nothing like column 1. And so, rather, as I've already explained to you, it makes no sense to think that we should be able to actually address column 3 using the same kind of medicine, the same kind of principles that have been so successful against column 1. But the other thing it tells you is perhaps even more important, namely that there is basically no difference between column 3 and column 4. That actually the only difference is semantic, that column 3 consists of the aspects of aging that we've chosen to give disease-like names to, and the ones in column 4 are the ones we haven't. So, no biological difference at all. A lot of people say that I say that the word disease should have an expanded definition and we should call aging a disease. I don't say anything of the kind. I actually say the opposite. I say that the use of the word disease should be narrowed so as not to include column 3. Because the fact is the things in column 3 are so different from the things that we normally call diseases that actually it confuses us. It's misleading to call them diseases. We should call them aspects of aging. All right. So I'm not actually the first person to come up with this new way of looking at aging. It's not new. More than a century ago, a few people started to realize that the geriatrics approach was completely silly, and you were never going to actually have much success against the health problems of old age that way, that you needed to be more preventative. And then they were inspired by a very important thing that we see in nature, namely a huge variation in the rate at which different species age. Some species age much more slowly than others. In other words, their metabolisms create damage more slowly than others. So, and even within a species, of course, there's a bit of a variation between individuals. So people thought, well, okay, maybe if we study this variation really, really hard, we'll be able to figure out enough about it that we can extrapolate. We can actually apply this knowledge to develop new medicines that will somehow make human metabolism run more cleanly, so to speak, generate damage more slowly than it normally would. And that would be great, because it would postpone the age at which the damage reaches this point that the body is not set up to tolerate, the point at which the pathologies emerge. Great idea. Completely unsuccessful. We've had absolutely no luck with that approach either. Why not? Simple answer. Metabolism is rather complicated. This is a simplified diagram of a small subset of what we know about how the body works. And you can see that it's rather messy. Since this is a digital conference, I imagine quite a lot of the people in the audience write software. And those of you who do will immediately see that this is the absolute, ultimate nightmare of uncommented spaghetti code. There is no way in hell that one is going to be able to tweak this system so as to stop it from doing the thing we don't want it to do, the creation of damage, without at the same time having unintended consequences that stop it from doing things we need it to do to keep us alive. It's just not going to happen. And of course, I'm actually understating the severity of this problem. The real problem is not just that this is a simplified diagram of a small subset of what we know about how the body works. The real problem is that it's a simplified diagram of a small subset of what we know about how the body works, which any biologist will agree is completely dwarfed by the astronomical amount that we don't know about how the body works. I mean, that's even ignoring all the stuff that we don't even know that we don't know. So, not a thing. But luckily, we're not done. There is a completely different third approach to this problem. Remember what the problem is. The challenge here, the goal, is to separate metabolism from pathology, to break this process. And what I've told you so far is that the process consists of two processes, the left-hand one and the right-hand one. The other thing I've told you is that we cannot break the overall process by breaking either of those two component processes. Neither of those approaches actually is practical. But there's a third way that we can break the overall process. We can leave the two component processes intact, but separate them from each other. And that's what the maintenance approach is. You go in and you periodically repair the damage, not necessarily all of it, but a lot of the damage that metabolism has been laying down, so that even though metabolism is continuing to lay down more damage, the damage does not rise in abundance to the point that is bad for you. That's all that the maintenance approach is. And of course, we already do it. Remember what I said earlier about how aging is not actually a phenomenon of biology. It's something that can be described in just the same way for simple man-made machines. Well, here is such a machine. This car is more than 100 years old. And, it's doing fine. It's working every bit as well as when it was built. Now, the question I want to highlight is, why? How has it survived this long? The answer is not that it was built to last that long. This car was designed to last maybe 10 or 15 years at the outside. But here it is. And the only reason it's here, that it has transcended its warranty period, is because it has benefited from unusually comprehensive, periodic, preventative maintenance. This concept works. But there's one catch, maybe, and you may have already noticed it. The body is a really, really complicated machine, and I've already told you in no uncertain terms that the metabolism, the overall way that the body works, is ridiculously far too complicated to mess with. And also I've told you that the pathologies of old age are really complicated as well. So a natural guess would be that the thing between them, this thing called damage, is also insanely complicated. And that would be a bit of a problem. It wouldn't change the fact that the maintenance approach is the common sense approach, but it would still mean that the maintenance approach is impractical. Luckily, however, that turns out not to be the case. The actual situation is that we can describe damage in rather simple terms. Essentially, we can classify everything that qualifies as damage, all of the molecular and cellular changes that we see, into just 7 major categories, which I'm listing on the left-hand side of this table. And you can see that these categories are, large. They have many examples within them, but still, they are categories. They're meaningful, concrete, down-to-earth biological phenomena. Now, I don't have all day, so I'm just going to mention the top one a little bit more. Cell loss, what's that? It's simply cells dying and not being automatically replaced by the division of other cells. So, of course, that's something that could be eventually bad for you. As the number of cells progressively declines, eventually there won't be enough for the organ in question to do its job. And a fine example of that in aging is Parkinson's disease, which is caused by the loss of a particular type of neuron in a particular part of the brain. Now, so what is the maintenance approach? What is the damage repair approach to fixing that loss of cells? The answer, of course, is simply stem cell therapy. We prepare cells in the laboratory into the right state so that we can inject them into the body and they will divide and transform themselves into replacements for, for the cells that the body is not replacing on its own. And sure enough, it works. At the moment, there are clinical trials going on that apply stem cells to Parkinson's disease, just as an example, and everyone's very optimistic. Now, SENS Research Foundation was set up because not everything in the left-hand side of this table has been moved along nearly so rapidly as that top one. The other things on the right-hand side are technologies that either were simply our ideas, or if they weren't our ideas, at least they weren't being pursued nearly aggressively enough. So we got in and tried to make a difference. And initially, a lot of people working on the biology of aging thought that this was a crazy idea. It was never actually going to be productive and effective. But gradually, over the years, I won people over. And now it's completely mainstream. This is a paper that came out just 5.5 years ago that reinvents the exact same idea. They divided aging into 9 categories instead of 7, but that's not because they thought of anything new. It's just a different way of subdividing. Basically, exactly the same idea. And as you can see now, this is mainstream. This paper has been cited like more than 2,000 times. It's going to be easily the most highly cited paper in the biology of aging this decade. And so that's very heartening. It means that we don't have to go around convincing people that the damage repair approach is practical anymore. But I do want to come back to something I said right at the beginning. Longevity is a side effect of health. People will often get terribly worried about the possibility that if we develop medicines for aging, we'll just be keeping people alive for a lot longer in a poor state of health that is characteristic of old people today. But in fact, it's the exact opposite. What we will be doing is keeping people healthy and youthful for a longer period, and that will have the side effect of keeping them alive. And yes, we think that's a good thing. So if you talk about this to people, you find that there's a lot of knee-jerk reactions out there. A lot of people will come along and say, oh dear, where will we put all the people, or won't dictators live forever, or won't it be boring, or doesn't death give meaning to life? These are just unbelievably idiotic things to say when you remember that this is all about health. Hands up, please. Raise your hand if you want to get Alzheimer's disease. Hands up if you want anybody else to get Alzheimer's disease, not counting your mother-in-law. Right? It's not very controversial, really, is it? Right? And of course, the world is going to be different when we don't have aging. But think about the ways in which it's going to be different. We won't have any sick people to speak of. Almost nothing. 90% of sickness, for sure, in the developed world anyway, is caused by having been born a long time ago. And 20 years from now, that'll be true in almost the whole world. So, it's going to be a much more prosperous, much more high-quality world. And there are various things we're going to want to change, like the way that pensions work, or the way that education works, and so on. And that's fine. And I'm fine with people worrying about these things and thinking them through and saying, well, okay, this may be a reason to develop better renewable energy or artificial meat or whatever, so as to increase the carrying capacity of the planet fast enough to cope with increased population, but that's not the kind of reaction that one normally gets. People tend to have a terrible tendency to assume that these problems on the left are completely insoluble, and therefore they are not so keen as they ought to be to develop these medicines in the first place. So, it's important to actually remember that it's just a side effect of something uncontroversial, namely health. So a little bit before I end about what we do. So we publish, of course, papers in the academic literature. This is just a small selection of the papers that we've published in the past several years, and I've chosen these ones because we're really proud of them. They are real breakthrough studies that kind of reinvigorated areas of research that were completely stalled because everyone had decided that the approach was too difficult. And because we're an independent foundation and we're funded by philanthropy rather than having to worry about peer-reviewed grant applications, we don't have the same pressure to publish easy stuff all the time, so we can do the really difficult stuff. So that's very nice. And what's even nicer, I've got a few examples of what happened to that. So what's even nicer is that we've been able to push these projects forward far enough that investors have started getting interested. So it's hard work running a charity because not many people want to give money away, or at least not large amounts of money. So, our budget at SENS Research Foundation has never been more than about $5 million per year, which is pitiful for something that is so important. But now we're in this rather splendid position where we've been able to spin out so far about half a dozen of our projects into startup companies that have been able to attract investors from people who have the vision, they understand the value of this, but they really don't like giving money away, but they're perfectly happy to invest in a high-risk but high-reward venture like this. So this is just one of our startup companies. It works on macular degeneration, which is the #1 cause of blindness in the elderly, and they've raised now more than $10 million. That's 2 whole years of our entire research budget. There's another company called Covalent, which is working on a type of heart disease called cardiac amyloidosis, which turned out to be really important cause of death in the extremely elderly, people over 100. And again, they've raised good money. Aragos is working on ways to preserve organs at very low temperatures so that they can be used for organ transplantation. This is Ocean Biotech that's working on eliminating senescent cells, which are cells that have got into a kind of deranged state where they're doing more harm than good, but the body is failing to get rid of them. And this is, by now, a very incomplete list of other companies that have emerged over the past just 2 or 3 years that are not actual spin-outs from our foundation, but they're doing very closely aligned work, very much within the same damage repair paradigm, and they're all getting funded really easily and really well. It's fantastic. I thought I'd talk about this one company a little bit more, Unity Biotechnology, because Unity are the best funded of these companies so far. A year ago, they raised $300 million or more. And that's the kind of money that a biotech company often will raise when it's towards the later stages of clinical trials, when almost all of the de-risking has been done, and the stuff that needs to be done there to get to actual approval and profitability is very little. Unity raised that same money in a far earlier stage, before they'd even begun their first clinical trial. That tells you how excited smart investors are about how big the rejuvenation biotechnology industry is going to be. It's going to be the biggest industry of all time. It's going to be bigger than the dot-com boom. I mean, look at today's anti-aging industry. The actual medicines that are available today are supposedly to treat aging. Now, we all know that these medicines don't work. But still, the anti-aging industry is humongous. It's enormous. So you can imagine how big an industry is going to be that actually is based on products that do work. However, the foundation is still an essential component of all of this. We still work on projects that are at too early a stage to be spun out. They're not quite investable yet. And we believe that things are moving so fast now, or even the most difficult areas, that pretty much everything is likely to be at least in clinical trials within only a couple of years from now. This deadline of 2021, we first started saying it about 3 years ago, and it hasn't slipped. We still believe that that's where things are going to be. So I'll stop there. I'll just mention that about a decade ago I wrote this book which covers the biology of all of this in much more detail. It's got a whole chapter on each of the 7 types of damage and the various ways to go about fixing them. And it's still pretty up to date. Of course, it's certainly not the case that progress has been minimal. Progress has been enormous. But the reason this book is still up to date is because the progress is pretty much exactly what we expected it to be back then. So that's, of course, very good news as well. The concepts that we put forward back then have very much stood the test of time, and that kind of tells you that they're likely to be right. They're likely to actually continue to stand the test of time. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.